HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Diabetes Burnout: What to Do When You Can't Take It Anymore by William H. Polonsky, Ph.D., CDE. Read by Chris Sorensen. Introduction. Is diabetes driving you crazy? If so, welcome to the club. In fact, a very large club. It has been my honor and pleasure to meet many thousands of people with diabetes over the years, and almost all of them are battling in some way or another with the illness. Some are infuriated with diabetes, some depressed. Others are frightened, frustrated, guilt-ridden, or in denial. Underlying all of these different emotions is something very important. A common psychological struggle that I never quite knew how to describe or explain until I met Howard, a young man who has been living with type 1 diabetes for most of his life. Howard had been at war with the disease since his early teenage years. In our very first meeting, he summed up his feelings about diabetes in a clear and concise manner. Diabetes sucks. Howard pinpointed for me how many of my patients really felt. Living with diabetes can be terribly frustrating and difficult. It is not just a simple matter of eating right or taking your medications properly. Diabetes is often an emotional struggle as well. Indeed, addressing and overcoming the emotional stresses of diabetes may be one of the most important steps you can take to manage the illness successfully. Unfortunately, it is too easy for both patients and doctors to neglect this personal side of the illness. Like many others, Howard was suffering from diabetes burnout. Burnout is what happens when you feel overwhelmed by diabetes and by the frustrating burden of diabetes self-care. People who have burned out realize that good diabetes care is important for their health, but they just don't have the motivation to do it. At a fundamental level, they are at war with their diabetes, and they are losing. Are you battling with diabetes burnout? Do any of the following sound familiar? Feeling overwhelmed and defeated by your diabetes. Feeling angry about diabetes, feeling frustrated by the self-care regimen, and/or having other strong negative feelings about diabetes. Feeling that diabetes is controlling or trying to control your life. Worrying that you are not taking care of your diabetes well enough and yet feeling unable, unmotivated, or unwilling to change. Telling yourself that diabetes management is not important, that complications can't happen to you, and yet not being able to escape a sense of impending doom. Partially or fully quitting your diabetes care, thinking about diabetes as little as possible, and telling yourself that living with high blood sugars is not a problem. Avoiding any and all diabetes-related tasks that might give you feedback about the consequences of your poor self-care. For example, blood glucose monitoring or doctor visits. Feeling alone with your diabetes, perhaps because you are feeling so ashamed about diabetes that you keep it a secret from everyone. The more of these items that accurately describe you, the more likely it is that you have burned out on diabetes. As you will see, diabetes burnout is understandable, but in the long term it is a destructive and deadly way of coping with diabetes. If you are feeling burned out, there are 3 important things you need to know. 1. You are not alone. Diabetes burnout is quite common. 2. You are not a bad person. Given the pressures and the disappointments associated with living with diabetes, burnout is understandable. 3. Your situation is far from hopeless. Burnout can be conquered. This book has been written especially for you who are feeling burned out by diabetes and for those who love you. It examines how the stresses of diabetes can build, how diabetes burnout occurs, and most importantly, how burnout can be overcome. So let's get started. Section 1. The Personal Side of Diabetes. Chapter 1. On the Road to Diabetes Burnout. From the outside, diabetes looks like it should be fairly simple. After all you have to do is take your insulin or oral medications every day at the right time and in the right amount, eat perfectly without ever cheating, check your blood glucose regularly, and exercise frequently. Balance these tasks with each other so that your blood glucose levels never get too low or too high. And don't gain or lose too much weight. Stay vigilant at all times just in case something goes wrong. Finally, remember that you must continue to do all of this every day for the rest of your life with no vacations from diabetes ever. Wow! Living with diabetes is not easy at all. No matter how much attention and effort you are able to give to your diabetes care, you can be certain that something will eventually go wrong. There will be crazy days when blood glucose levels rise or fall dramatically for no apparent reason. There will be frustrating days when you just can't stop eating. And there may be scary days when minor or major complications suddenly appear. Joan Williams Hoover is a well-known author in diabetes who first developed the concept of diabetes burnout. In an article for physicians, she describes how diabetes can require a great deal of personal effort and a large number of personal decisions every day. Most importantly, she writes, "And even the constant need for decisions might be tolerable if only the results were predictable. Few things generate burnout like the awful frustration of having followed instructions and done everything just right and still be failing to get the diabetes into control. At those times, it seems no use to continue to try. Think how discouraging it is to fail at something you really wanted to do. Then consider what it must feel like to have diabetes and be failing at something you never ever wanted to do in the first place." Given all of the work, responsibility, decisions, and at least occasional disappointment, it is remarkable that anyone is able to manage diabetes successfully year after year. There are some people who do. However, for many others, the frustrations of diabetes can become overwhelming, leading to feelings of helplessness, depression, or even worse. Let's meet some of these folks. Mel's story. When I met Mel, he was 29 years old. He was a hard-working carpenter who had been living with type 1 diabetes for 18 years. As a teenager, Mel and his parents had often battled about his diabetes care. His parents had demanded that he manage his diabetes very carefully, but they never really offered any help. They insisted that you learn to take care of it by yourself. During his high school years, Mel began to feel more and more irritated and burdened by the demands of diabetes, especially because he wanted to fit in with his schoolmates. He fought more and more frequently with his parents, and he began to feel that there was just no good reason to go along with their demands for better self-care. Since high school, Mel had mostly ignored his diabetes, though he had always taken his insulin regularly. He had never followed any type of meal plan, and he tended to eat large amounts of chocolate and other sweets every day. He checked his blood glucose about once every month or so. Why bother checking more? It's always high, he told me, and he almost never saw a doctor. None of his friends knew that he had diabetes, and Mel himself did his best to think about it as little as possible. Although he insisted that diabetes was no big deal, Mel had become increasingly worried about the possibility of long-term complications. And although he didn't like talking about it, Mel admitted that he had always been angry about his diabetes and that he had felt overwhelmed and defeated by the illness for many years. Lois's story. Lois was a 54-year-old administrator for a local school system. She had been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes when she was 48. Frightened by the possibility of long-term complications, she had always been anxious to manage her diabetes well. She told me that she had been relatively successful in the first months following diagnosis, but she soon became overwhelmed and frustrated. The hospital dietitian had recommended a highly structured meal plan that required Lois to give up many of her favorite foods. As the months wore on, this new way of eating felt more and more restrictive. Following her doctor's advice, Lois had also tried to begin a regular walking schedule. However, the demands of her job soon made this too difficult to follow. Despite Lois's best efforts over those first few months, she was unable to lose weight and had experienced several frightening episodes of mild hypoglycemia, low blood glucose. Not surprisingly, Lois's attempts at self-management had slowly deteriorated. By the time we met, she was continuing to take her oral medication faithfully each day, but she was checking her blood glucose only rarely. She was following her prescribed meal plan, but only through the daylight hours. By dinner time, Lois would begin to binge on cookies and crackers, and this would continue unchecked until bedtime. She had not taken a brisk walk or done any serious exercise in years. Her husband and close friends were worried about her health and were constantly pushing her to try harder. But this had not been helpful. It had only increased her sense of isolation with diabetes. Lois tried not to think about her illness and avoided seeing her physician, who she feared would recommend that she begin taking insulin. When she did allow herself to think about diabetes, she felt angry and frustrated with herself. Regina's story. Regina was a 19-year-old college student. As she described it to me, she had been at war with diabetes ever since she was diagnosed at age 12. Regina came from a cold and violent home. Her parents were so busy fighting with each other that there was little time available to help Regina manage her diabetes. Her blood glucose control was very poor. She averaged 1 or 2 admissions for diabetic ketoacidosis, DKA, each year. Regina had lived on her own for the past 2 years, and her poor diabetes self-management had only worsened. Her doctor had prescribed a regimen that included long-acting, ultralente, and short-acting, regular insulins. However, Regina had not taken any ultralente in over a year, and she only took regular insulin, typically in very large amounts, every several days when she suspected that DKA was approaching. Regina had not tested her blood glucose in several years. She was obese and was preoccupied with losing weight. She felt unable to control her eating, which included multiple episodes of binging each day and occasional vomiting. Regina felt ashamed about her behavior and frightened that long-term complications would affect her soon. She was angry at her diabetes and angry at her physician, whom she saw as blaming and uncaring. She felt depressed and hopeless. Regina was anxious to change, but she feared that any attempt at better blood glucose control would lead to even greater weight gain. Sam's story. Sam was 66 years old and a successful businessman. He had been living with type 2 diabetes for 3 years. Despite pleas from his family and physician, Sam saw little reason to make any changes in his lifestyle for diabetes. He did not mind taking his oral medications each day, However, he saw no point in adjusting his eating or being less sedentary. Sam's blood glucose levels were consistently above 250 milligrams per deciliter, and his cholesterol and blood pressure were both dangerously high. But this did not seem important to him. As he explained it to me, "What's the difference? We're all going to die anyway." Sam's wife, who was worried sick about him, would argue with him constantly. She urged him to stop eating so many sweets, to start exercising, and to see his doctor more regularly. But none of this had any effect on Sam. Many years earlier, Sam had seen his father die from complications caused by diabetes. He was certain that this was to be his fate as well. In his heart, Sam felt doomed by the illness. The diagnosis had been a death sentence, and Sam believed that there was nothing he could do to alter his own fate. Burnout is common. There are many people with stories similar to those of Mel, Lois, Regina, and Sam. They are male and female, young and old, new to diabetes, and veterans of the disease. They are not bad, stupid, or weak people. They are normal people who are struggling with diabetes for understandable reasons. And their struggles take many shapes. Many feel out of control and overwhelmed by their diabetes. They feel helpless that things can ever improve. Some feel alone with their diabetes. Others battle with denial, never truly accepting the reality of diabetes in their lives. And what they all have in common is diabetes burnout. Burnout and poor self-care. Even though there has been such positive news over the past few years about the great benefits of good self-care, diabetes self-care seems to be growing worse and worse. Research evidence now clearly shows that blood glucose management and other healthy actions can dramatically lower your risk of long-term complications. But as can be seen from the statistics in the section News about Diabetes Self-Care, many people are not taking advantage of this opportunity to ensure a longer and healthier life for themselves. This is not because they lack willpower or are stupid. Instead, the major culprit is diabetes burnout. Why? Because burnout saps your motivation to take care of yourself. And not taking care of yourself can lead to long-term complications such as eye, kidney, or heart disease. The job of diabetes. Consider this analogy. Have you ever known anyone who had a frustrating job in which he or she worked harder and harder each day, yet it seemed that his or her actions didn't make any real difference? For example, a nurse on a cancer ward works hard for the patients every day. Despite her efforts and caring, she has not received a raise in many years. Her supervisors and colleagues never congratulate her on the great work she is doing, and many of her patients continue to worsen and die. Over time, these stresses begin to take their toll. The nurse may end up feeling helpless, chronically overextended and depleted, inadequate and guilty that she is somehow failing at her job. These are the core features of burnout. Living with diabetes can be a very similar kind of job, especially if you begin to feel that the day-to-day effort needed to manage diabetes is too burdensome and frustrating, and the results not good enough to make the effort worthwhile. Much like the nurse suffering from job burnout, the person with diabetes burnout may feel very mixed up about whether he wants to continue his job. He may hate diabetes and believe that it controls his life, yet he knows that he cannot quit. He may even become preoccupied with worry about diabetes while at the same time doing as little as possible. News about diabetes self-care. Here are some statistics that may surprise you. 1. Problems with blood glucose monitoring. In a nationwide survey, 21% of patients with type 1 diabetes reported that they never checked their blood glucose levels. Never. Of those patients with type 2 diabetes using insulin, 41% never monitored. Of those with type 2 who were not using insulin, 76% reported that they never monitored. In recent surveys at the Joslin Diabetes Center and 2 large clinics in California, my colleagues and I found that 21 to 25% of patients rarely or never followed their doctor's recommendations for blood glucose monitoring. In a recent nationwide survey, 12% of patients reported rarely or never following recommendations for checking their blood glucose levels. 2. Problems with healthy eating. In recent surveys, 10 to 24% of patients with diabetes reported that they rarely or never follow their healthcare team's dietary recommendations. In our Joslin survey, 22% of patients reported knowing that they were supposed to follow a certain meal plan, but they felt that it was usually or always impossible to do so. A study of a well-known diabetes education program showed that the program greatly helped patients to begin eating better and exercising more. However, when contacted 1 year later, most patients had returned to their old, less healthy habits. 3. Problems with regular exercise. In recent national surveys, 31 to 38% of patients with diabetes reported that they rarely or never follow their healthcare team's recommendations for regular exercise. In our recent surveys of patients with diabetes, my colleagues and I found that 37 to 43% of patients never exercise. Only 38% manage to exercise 3 times per week or more. 4. Problems with diabetes medications. A series of studies have found that many women with type 1 diabetes, somewhere between 10% and 40% depending on the study, regularly take less than the prescribed amount of insulin. One new study also suggests that some patients take less than the prescribed amount of their oral diabetes medications. The challenge of burnout. In my own practice, I have met far too many people who, because of diabetes burnout, have chosen to ignore their diabetes for years, or in some cases, decades. Tragically, many have been hit hard by long-term complications: eye disease, kidney disease, heart disease, painful nerve damage, amputations, and more. The arrival of serious complications is sometimes a wake-up call for taking charge of one's diabetes management, but not always. Diabetes burnout is so powerful that it can persist even in the face of complications. However, diabetes burnout is not invincible. The good news is that it can be defeated. All of the people who you have met in this chapter, Mel, Lois, Regina, and Sam, have overcome burnout and have made peace with diabetes. They are successfully managing their blood glucose levels, and they are living healthy and satisfying lives. You can too. Chapter 2. The real story about motivation in diabetes. Recognizing and overcoming barriers. Why is diabetes self-care so difficult for so many people? If you are struggling with unhealthy eating habits, a reluctance to monitor your blood glucose, or some other self-care problem, what is really keeping you from managing your diabetes more successfully? Many people, including a large number of healthcare providers, believe that the explanation is a lack of self-discipline, too little willpower, stupidity, or denial. In other words, they think you are just not trying hard enough. But there is little scientific evidence to support these beliefs. People who are managing their diabetes poorly do not necessarily have a problem with self-discipline or willpower. And there is no evidence that those with poor self-care are less frightened about long-term complications than anyone else. Indeed, our research has shown the opposite to be true. Those with the poorest self-management are often more frightened about complications than those with better self-care. It is easy to accuse someone of not having enough willpower or not accepting their diabetes, but that is usually unfair and inaccurate. For many people, the real reason for poor self-management is diabetes burnout. Who isn't motivated? To truly understand burnout, we must consider 3 truths about motivation and diabetes care. 1. No one is unmotivated to take care of his or her diabetes. No one. Instead, they are perfectly motivated to do just what they are doing, and that's the problem. For example, Mrs. Smith has not followed her doctor's request that she exercise, specifically that she go for a walk after dinner each evening. She is not unmotivated to go walking. She likes the idea of exercise very much. However, she is more strongly motivated to do what she has always done: watch Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy, her favorite TV shows, instead. The important point here is that no one, neither you nor anyone else, is in need of a motivation transplant. Rather, you need to understand the unique pressures that make it hard for you to take care of diabetes. 2. There are many long-term benefits to taking care of diabetes, but not very many immediate ones. For every interesting decision that needs to be made, should I eat that lovely piece of cake, we think first about short-term consequences. That's going to taste really good, and then, to a lesser extent, about long-term consequences. If I keep eating so many sweets, I'm likely to have higher blood glucose levels, and this increases my risks for complications. Unfortunately, the decisions most human beings make are more strongly influenced by their thoughts about short-term results than by their thoughts about long-term results. In fact, short-term consequences are so powerful that they can cause us to change our behavior and our attitudes without even realizing that we're doing so. Unfortunately, in a disease like diabetes, the most important benefits are not immediate, in particular the prevention of long-term complications, whereas there can be immediate positive consequences for ignoring diabetes concerns. This cake tastes terrific. So it is easy to see how short-term influences could lead to a loss of interest in diabetes self-care. 3. No one feels motivated to do something if the costs seem to outweigh the benefits. There are costs and benefits, pros and cons for every possible diabetes self-care action, whether it be eating healthfully, checking your blood glucose, or making time for exercise. You make self-care decisions, often without knowing it, on the basis of your beliefs about those costs and benefits. If it seems to you that the benefits clearly outweigh the costs, managing diabetes will feel relatively easy. However, if you see diabetes care as being such a burden that it outweighs the potential benefits, then it may seem completely reasonable to try and ignore your diabetes. So diabetes burnout is more likely to occur when you believe the costs of taking good care of diabetes outweigh any possible benefits. Even if you know that there are several powerful benefits to taking good care of diabetes, the barriers to good self-management can often seem enormous. It is important to take a good hard look at the benefits of and the barriers to effective diabetes care. The benefits of good care. 2 major benefits of effective diabetes management are: A positive impact on long-term complications, a healthier and more vibrant life for the future. A positive impact on short-term complications, a healthier and more vibrant life.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?